Well, good afternoon, or not quite good afternoon. Good midday. I'm Matt Gallman. I was on the search committee that hired Bill Link, so I take credit indirectly for all that has transpired. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a great event, wonderfully organized, and when that committee hired Bill, one of the big points of conversation was the graduate program. And this session and this entire event is testimony to how Bill really helped the graduate program, which is a particular pleasure. And it's a wonderful pleasure to introduce our two speakers. I will introduce you separately. And that way I can stand up and talk again. Our first speaker, and let me just say, both of them were just wonderful dissertations. Courtney Taylor is from North Carolina. She received her BA from North Carolina Central and her master's at UNC Greensboro. And then she came down here to take on our PhD program. She received a PhD in 2010 with actually a West African history minor field, which was also really strong. Her research interests center upon slave experience during the antebellum period as it relates to enslaved African-American females. Regarding her teaching experience, Dr. Moore-Taylor has taught courses in both African history and African-American studies, which we think is a real thing, and the African American Studies Senior Seminar. Prior to joining the African American Studies faculty at the University of Florida, Taylor actually served in the history department at Santa Fe College, but I don't know the details, but we stole her. We're happy she's here. She will be speaking on the dawn of life.
Good morning to each of you. I'd like to first and foremost say that it is indeed a pleasure to be here celebrating with Dr. Link on reaching this milestone in his career. And I am grateful for the opportunity to be able to share, not just from the standpoint of my research, but to also to be able to engage just the interaction that he and I had over the course of, as I thought about it, I've known you over 20 years. So when I met him, I was in my early to mid 20s, and now I'm not in my early to mid 20s. As I was getting ready to come up and speak, I realized, oh, don't forget your reading glasses, or this is not going to go well at all. So I want to kind of open by just engaging in his legacy in terms of my professional development before I kind of dive into to my research. I also want to thank some of my students for being here today. These are an amazing group of young people who, honestly, when we are in the classroom, I am taken aback by the insights they provide, by their takes on primary sources that we engage, and how they challenge my thinking. And so in light of everything that the state is kind of involved in, to hear their fresh take on their education and how it's been politicized is indeed, again, refreshing, and I'm glad to see so many of them out today. And so, just to kind of get us started, I wanted to just open up with how Dr. Link and I connected. So well over 2 decades ago, when he served as the chair of the history department at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, I happened to be in a class by Dr. Paula McGee, who was, well, she was ABD, so she's on her way to becoming a PhD. And so through encountering Mrs. McGee in her class, she introduced me to Dr. Frank Woods, who was the director at the time of the African American Studies program at UNCG, and then she also introduced me to Dr. William Link. Little did I know that those introductions would forever change the trajectory of my life. And so consequently, Dr. Link would lead and guide my research as it related to Black women who were enslaved. And he also really introduced me to how to conduct myself in an archive, which was insightful. Just going to those spaces, and first of all, seeing the spaces for me was just like, wow. And then when they hand you those documents that are decades old and all those restrictions, like you have to leave your bag out the door and all those things that people miss today because everything has been digitized, it was through his introduction to that I was able to embark on what has been truly a really great journey. And so I worked with him at UNCG. We completed my master's. I took a year off to apply, and at that time, UNCG was actually beginning to start a PhD program. I applied to that PhD program, I was accepted, and so in my mind, I'm gonna cruise right on. And so one day, I don't know if you remember, you came to my office because I was lecturing in African American Studies, and you offered me this opportunity because you had just accepted a new position, and you asked if I would come with you to the University of Florida. And sight unseen, I said yes. And July, it will be 19 years since I've been in Gainesville, Florida, and I can say that although all the days weren't all that positive, there were some days after I came that I was literally crying in his office, and his words reassuring me that it was going to be okay and that I could get to the end helped me. And then I happened to meet a wonderful man, and he convinced me that I should stay a little bit longer. And so although Dr. Link is returning to our home state, I've kind of dug my heels here in Gainesville, Florida, and I certainly want to work to continue the legacy that he started through the work that I'm attempting to do. So now his legacy as it relates to me, for the better part of the time since I've been out of graduate school, I've worked as a teacher. And so in reconnecting with Heather, one of my colleagues at the time, she and I both know what it's like to work at a teaching-focused institution. It leaves little to no time to engage in the research aspect because typically I had a 5.5 at Santa Fe for over 11 years. She just told me she had, what, a 7.74? Yeah, that's a lot. And so when I think about the impact that Dr. Link had on me from a teaching standpoint, because he really is a teacher at his core, he was always very constructive in his criticism. Now, he would have a lot of markings on those chapters that I submitted to him, but he always started out with a very positive note. Like, these are your strengths, these are the things that we're going to push towards improving. And even though I knew I had a lot of work to do, I didn't necessarily leave his office feeling defeated, like this just isn't going to get done. He applied steady pressure for completion. So we all know people who get lost in that kind of ABD world. If you were a Link student, that was not going to be your reality because he was pushing you constantly to get to that finish line. Prompt feedback. I don't care when I sent him an email, without fail, he was going to respond to that email to where one day I'm like, is he literally sitting with the laptop on his lap just waiting for emails because he responded that quickly? And I find that in my own teaching, those are the types of things that I attempt to do. I attempt to be honest with my students that these are the challenges that I see with your work, but at the same time, we can constructively work to get this where it needs to be. I strive to be steady with my pressure for completion of assignments, and I certainly really work on providing prompt feedback. My policy is within 24 hours, if you have not heard from Dr. Taylor, it's something wrong, so you need to make sure that you get back with me. From the standpoint of a historian, just his love for Southern history, that has resonated with me. The way that he unravels and continues to unravel complicated stories, particularly using unconventional sources that people may not necessarily consider. The creativity that he uses, that he brings to the table with those sources has certainly been a part of what I perceive to be his legacy, will continue to be, and just again centering unlikely sources, which kind of brings me to my research, which is certainly dealing with a group of people that most people would never consider as it relates to the institution of slavery. Now, as a child, I always loved history, And it was something about studying slavery that captivated me in a way like nothing else. And so from 5th grade, remembering when my teacher let me teach the social studies lesson on that subject, to the point that I encountered Dr. Lydia Lindsay at North Carolina Central University. I was able to connect with a fellow NCCU alum this morning, which has been great. I've been able to encounter a group of extraordinary young women that for the most part have been neglected. And my research as a dissertation student, and recently I'm returning to the University of Florida and resuming that research, is attempting to uncover that story. Now, at the time that I started this project, and essentially my love for studying enslaved women started at NCCU. It was actually after a project that I suggested to Dr. Lindsay in her research methods class. We had to do, the major project, and I said, I'm going to write on Du Bois and Washington and their conflict. And she said, no, you're not going to write on Du Bois and the conflict between Washington, because I need for you to really think about a significant research project. And so that led me to consider, at that time, being a young black woman in the institution of slavery, the intersectionality of that. And so by the time I got to UNCG, I was well onto the path of wanting to know about enslaved women. And at that point, there still wasn't a great deal of work done about the subject matter, but I felt like there was still more to be done. And that's where the introduction of age into that experience came into play. And so it became a matter of wanting to discover and understand what it was like to go through puberty while being considered a piece of property. And so that became a component of my application process to enter the University of Florida. And then that was the basis of the topic that Dr. Link would help navigate and guide me through as I moved through my dissertation process. Now, today's topic is entitled Dawn of Life, and it comes from a direct quote by Harriet Jacobs. She states, "Everywhere the years bring to all enough of sin and sorrow. Yet, in slavery, the very dawn of life is darkened by these shadows." My research seeks to outline key indicators enslaved teenagers experience, rights that were the very shadows that Jacobs alluded to. Now, as I stated, while at Santa Fe College, I wasn't really able to engage this topic like I wanted to. And it has just been most recently, returning to the University of Florida, that I've been able to pick the topic back up. And when I decided that I wanted to do so, I went back to my advising chair, and he was right there with open arms, waiting to assist. And I found that my lived experiences, now as a wife, and certainly as a mother of a young black girl, certainly is shaping and informing not only how I revisit the project, but it's also informing how I can contemplate and deal with contemporary issues that Alexis is going to have to grapple in the 21st century that I find is directly linked to challenges that enslaved youth encounter. Now, when we think about girlhood, I think it's important to note, one, that black girlhood is a newly formed kind of area. Even though the study itself has been around for quite some time, when Dr. Link and I was working on the project, it was a black girlhood project, but essentially in terms of it being a program, rather a area of study where scholars are devoted to that, they've been identified within the field, that's relatively new. And I find that it's important that we engage this topic, one, as it relates to race. Because typically we find that most people think of girlhood as being this idyllic scene, as the image denotes. It's girls playing, it's doing hair, it's arts, all of those things. But imagine the impact that race plays even today, and certainly so much so during the time period that I'm engaging. Now, when I determined that I wanted to engage the institution of slavery in light of age and how it impacted teenage slave girls, Dr. Link certainly was on board with that. The sources that we determined would be best consisted of not only traditional sources, such as WPA interviews, slave narratives, but the work that he had done extensively in criminal court records would be an area that he would also push me towards. In dealing with those traditional sources, he encouraged me to look at it with new eyes, that these are sources. Harriet Jacobs, people were very much aware of Harriet Jacobs, yet they had never really contemplated her life from the standpoint of it being a work that really sought to explore the dynamics of the adolescent period. He cautioned me when it came to the WPA narratives that certainly we are aware of the limitations, but he said, Courtney, think about it. The vast majority of the individuals that were giving these interviews were people who literally were right in that age demographic that you are attempting to uncover and to study. And so it was his knowledge of the source material previously, coupled with his desire to see me push this project forward, that really helped me to be able to complete a dissertation that, when you think about it, it was 237 pages of a work about people who, for the most part, the vast majority of them could not read or write and never left a written record. And yet, I had to be creative in how I entered these archival sites to try to find their voices. I had to be intentional and to recognize that all those slave masters, slave mistresses in their papers aren't necessarily recounting these events for the sake of relaying Maddie Curtis's account or for the sake of telling what Judy was doing. But if I read the material in such a way that I'm looking for these individuals, I can certainly relay that. In terms of scholarship, he wanted to know, who is this work going to be in conversation with? How is it going to add to the discipline? How is it going to not only add to the scholarship that's existing, but what questions is it going to prompt that will lead us to try to grapple with it in ways that you may not necessarily be able to contemplate in your particular piece? And so with that, naturally, Deborah Gray White's work would be significant. Wilma King's work, Stolen Childhood. He introduced me to Todd Savitt, and looking at Maria Schwartz and Born in Bondage, a whole host of individuals who were embarking on really unique paths to try to unravel what the enslaved experience was like. Age studies, which were really beginning to grow and develop at the time, influenced my work as well. And then most recently, in returning to the work, things like Black Girlhood in the 19th Century by Dr. Wright, as she explores the transition from youthful girlhood to prematurely knowing via literature. Most recently, I'm looking at a work by Tia Miles, All That She Carried, which has been amazing just in a few chapters that I have been able to engage. And so the hope in what I've completed with my dissertation, and certainly what I hope to move forward with the research as I return to it, is that I will be able to continue to look at resources and source material that others may not have necessarily considered, but to also continue to add to the dialogue. Now, this scholarship seeks to determine the point in the spectrum of their lives where slaves grapple with the reality that they're regarded as property and not people. It pinpoints the exact moment, the epiphany that Jacobs referred to as that dawn of life. And what my research has determined is that occurred at enslaved adolescents through specific rites of passage. And what the work attempts to do is it not only wants to identify what those rites of passage are, but it reveals just as much about the individuals who enslaved these young women. It reveals that whites needed mature, docile slaves, and therefore they tried to shape slaves' identity to fortify their labor force, increase profitability, and buttress white identity and authority. Masters attempted to retain exclusive power in defining a slave's character. Teenage experiences made clear that young bondspeople were progressing toward adulthood, exerting some leverage in that process. Considering these factors, this becomes an account that moves beyond a simplistic view of slavery. It's the multifaceted story of antebellum identity construction, slaves' teens' maturation, power struggles, and the Southern violence that erupted when these components collided. Now, what we want to explore is essentially what were the key factors that led these individuals to this awareness. Because the reality is that when you look at most WPA narratives, slave narratives, they relay that as children, most slaves were left only to idleness and carelessness, hardly coming under the notice of their owner. But this is going to change drastically. Returning to Jacobs, we find that as a youngster, Jacobs was oblivious to her status. Her mother's death at 6 years old brought the realization that she was a slave. Still, her understanding remained ambiguous at best. She did not realize her lot completely until her early teens, when she entered in the service of a new master, James Norcom, a local physician. New responsibilities led her and other youth to recognize their separation from the, and I quote, tender endearments of childhood, concluding sadly, as one young boy, that he was a slave. Sources uncover ex-slaves speaking at length about experiences associated with puberty, making clear that the teenage experience was a crucial time in their lives because it triggered adolescents' realization that they were no longer children. Having reviewed countless sources, I determined three main components linked to this understanding. There were changes in work, changes in dress, and changes in their knowledge of sex. Now, the realization began first at around 10 to 12 years of age, when most slaves were put to work. As children, they did little to no work, and as I explained to my students, when you think about contemporary children today, when they're little and they see big people working, they want to help. So when Alexis was 5, 6, 7, and even some now, like if I'm doing laundry, if I'm sweeping, Mommy, can I help? Mommy, can I help? So that was the same premise for enslaved children, that they wanted to mimic adults. They didn't see giving out water or fanning flies as something that constituted work. However, that began to change drastically between 10 to 12 years of age. Most enslaved children began to work in the big house. Those who did not continue in that line of work would be sent to the fields. And this is significant because, one, it exposes them to adults that they may not have been familiar with outside of the slave community. Particularly white adults, especially if they're placed in the big house, they're also going to be exposed to corporal punishment. Because once they're placed in these fields, overseers do not regard the fact that this is your first day and you're only 10 years of age. And so that whip is going to fall on your back like it does any other. And so for these young people who now went from their task being running around playing with the slave masters and mistresses' children, it becomes a formalized introduction to work. This is certainly going to be a pivotal moment in their lives and their sense of consciousness. Now, currently, I am working, or I concluded work on the aspect of slavery, an article that's currently under review, and in that work, it's entitled Badge of Slavery. Harriet Jacobs, in her particular narrative, she describes her dress that she was given, and she said that it was a badge of slavery that I refused to wear. And because she recognized that she had resources and privileges that common slaves didn't have through her grandmother, she could make that choice that she was going to reject that garb. But what about the countless other enslaved youth who, in going from either being naked or wearing what was known as a shirt, a shift, or a slip, began to see that my life is going to be vastly different. And I find this particular right to be so significant because in stepping out in a dress, their action says more than anything that a master or a slave parent can say. Because if you're a master and you see that child in a shift or a slip, then from a capitalistic standpoint, this is a child that easily could die. We know that mortality rates among enslaved people were far higher. In fact, 50% of all enslaved youth died before the age of 5. We know that this is a child that has not appreciated in value. You cannot reap the economic benefits from this particular individual. But the day that that girl goes in that cabin and she comes out with a dress, it speaks volumes. For that slave parent, it incites a sense of fear and anxiety. Because at this point, they begin to recognize and know that this child is now in a position to where they can easily be caught up in the domestic slave trade. And research proves that enslaved youth around the age of the girls that I study are the ones that are certainly going to be a part of those millions who were transported from the Upper South into the Deep South. And so it brings a sense of alarm for them, but for enslaved masters, it means that they have been able to begin to reap the benefits of the profits that these young women can now bring. Because now they're not only going to be good for production, but they're also going to be good for reproduction, and that's only going to enhance their coffers. Now, as a teen, you will receive 2 clothing allotments per year. This would include shoes and headdress for females. The reasons for the change would include work, but also physical changes. So in encountering the WPA narratives, they are indeed somewhat silent concerning discussions of topics like menstrual cycles, because that was indeed a taboo conversation. But in encountering an enslaved North Carolinian by the name of Mattie Curtis, she described how she would receive her first dress because she stated, "I went as naked as your hand until my nature came to me, and my mother went to the master and said I had to have a dress." And so we know, based on scholarly source material concerning the age that most enslaved youth began their menstrual cycles, conversations similar to that of Mattie Curtis, that these types of changes would occur at a very pivotal point. They have mixed emotions. For some, it is an indication that I'm an adult, that I am able to reap the benefits of what comes with being an adult, such as going out to parties, being able to engage in courtship. But on one hand, where it brings freedom, it's also very constraining and binding in that these same dresses would bring long, grueling work hours, physical as well as emotional abuse. Now, these changes in work and clothing would also occur around the same time that these young girls are being exposed to more sexual knowledge. And that sexual knowledge could be both voluntary through courting, kissing games, a whole host of things that WPA narratives engage, and then also it could be through involuntary relationships, things that Harriet Jacobs, Elizabeth Kegley, and others describe in their work. Now, when you see these rights and they're identified, it's easy to simply say, okay, these are individuals who accepted their lot and they moved forward as being adult enslaved women, but we find the resistance component. And that was something that I hadn't necessarily considered when I started the project, but Dr. Link would be adamant that we needed to consider that aspect with the work. And so through selecting lovers, rejecting slave dresses, or violently attacking the system, and the whites who upheld it, young girls often went to great lengths, employing innovative techniques to resist their oppressors. Indeed, some assented in covert ways, and still others intensified their resistance. During these struggles, black and white onlookers alike concluded, like Jacobs, and I quote, "Masters had power on their side. Slaves had a determined will. There is might in each." Now, in terms of things that I concluded about this particular work, one was the fact that these individuals had a dual sense of consciousness. They recognized certainly that they were indeed enslaved property, but to use the words of Elizabeth Kegley, one of the individuals that I referenced throughout the work, that they were free in thought but fettered in action. And so they would find ways to continue to assert their humanity. And this is going to be especially important once you leave the institution of slavery and freedom comes after the American Civil War. Now, the goal is that, in terms of implications, that this work will lead to other individuals asking even more questions, and not only from the standpoint of a historical discussion, but also recognizing the need to center black girls within scholarship across interdisciplinary communities. It also needs to hopefully work to deal with trying to look at the roles of black girls in modern society, and certainly that has been the case as I look at recent studies that deal with adultification and young black girls. This has been of personal interest as well, because based on studies, one being Girlhood Interrupted, the erasure of black girls' childhood, this 2017 report stated that girls as early as 5 years of age certainly began to feel more pronounced in terms of how they're treated by larger society, being viewed as certainly older, and that adversely impacts their treatment within the criminal justice system as well as within the educational system. In my work with clothing, I've been able to make a direct correlation between the impact of clothing with these antebellum girls with the impact of clothing with young black girls with dress code systems that are perpetuated across the United States throughout various communities. Now, before I conclude, I would like to say that my goal for the project is to hopefully, as most historians' goal is to work so that it brings about positive impact within the larger community. Because at the end of the day, our work should help to inform and hopefully bring about more positive good in the present world that we live in. And so to that end, I'm working with local communities, speaking at schools. I was amazed in going to a local school and sharing this research, how these high school students ate it up, just their interest into the source material. So much so that I had to say, okay, the time is up, we have to stop, move on. Next week, we're hosting a group of young women from a local charter school, and so we're going to expose them to this material. The goal is to not only inform them about the institution of slavery in a way that they may not have ever experienced, but to also hopefully begin to inform policy to help to enhance and modify the curriculum, which is not necessarily a thing you want to do in the state of Florida at this particular point, but we're going to try anyway. And so I'm again indebted to Dr. Link for just seeing the promise of this particular research project, for helping me cross the finish line in 2010, and for being willing to pick up the mantle and to direct me to sources, resources, introduce me to people to get this project up and moving again. I sincerely wish you all the best as you enter this new period in your life, and I thank all of you for being a kind and attentive audience. Thank you.
That is a thrilling project, and I'm thrilled that Dr. Moore-Taylor is bringing it to its conclusion, not conclusion, but publication. It really is an important project, and a project full of valuable, creative research analysis, which leads us very cleverly to Allison Fredette, whose dissertation was also one based on phenomenal use of creative evidence, or phenomenally creative use of phenomenal evidence. Allison received her MA from West Virginia, University of West Virginia, and then she came to Gainesville, where she received her PhD here in 2014 and added a certificate in women's studies. Her first book, Marriage on the Border, Love, Mutuality, and Divorce in the Upper South During the Civil War, dissertation revised, was published by University Press of Kentucky in 2020. And she's also published chapters in several edited volumes, including Rethinking American Emancipation and a book called A Cultural History of Marriage in the Age of Enlightenment. She also has edited a collection of local divorce records, which will be coming out in the spring, called Heartsick and Astonished, Divorce in Civil War Era West Virginia. And today she'll be speaking on One Pillar of the Social Fabric May Still Stand Firm. Allison Fredette.
You can talk amongst yourself for a minute while I pull up my slideshow. So as was mentioned, I worked with Bill Link here at Florida from 2008 to 2014. This work was originally in the Rethinking American Emancipation book, which Jim and Bill edited, and they so kindly asked me to be a part of. And then the book itself, which this is also in, was published in the series that was mentioned last night, which is edited by Michelle and Bill. So obviously I would not even be here at all if it were not for Bill. So I'm gonna do the opposite of Courtney, and I'm gonna speak first about my research and then reflect a little on Bill's work. From the moment the first enslaved people took flight during the Civil War, the process of Black emancipation profoundly shook the core of traditional white Southern society. Throughout the antebellum slave South, law and custom reinforced a strictly hierarchical social structure that upheld elite white male authority over both social inferiors and household dependents. Many Southerners understood slavery and gender roles within the household as irrevocably linked and viewed an attack on one as an attack on the other. By the 1860s, secession debates and Confederate rhetoric urged white Southerners to defend their households as well as their way of life against Northern attackers. Yet by taking up arms to defend their homes, white Southerners unintentionally brought about the end of the slave system and threatened the household itself. With the end of the war, both emancipation and divorce exposed the inherent dissolvability of social relationships, which ultimately threatened to reveal white male authority as tenuous and unstable. So basically, my paper today looks at the ways in which Black emancipation had these ripple effects on white Southern households, and basically the ways in which they did or did not cause white Southern households to rethink their attitudes toward gender roles and other hierarchies within the household. So the idea of this is that at this moment where you have white Southern society seeing this questioning of this major hierarchy, racial hierarchy, and the slave system itself, you also have a moment that it causes them to reconsider their gender roles and gender hierarchy as well. But ultimately, as we know, and as the edited collection Rethinking American Emancipation looked at, emancipation was an uneven process that varied depending on which region of the South you were looking at. I personally studied the border South, the upper South, and so I really wanted to consider the ways in which emancipation and the unique ways in which it happened here shaped the unique attitudes toward gender. So specifically, I'm looking at what I call Eastern Virginia, but most people would just call Virginia, but I'm from West Virginia, so I'm gonna call it Eastern Virginia. I'm looking at West Virginia, the new state of West Virginia, a little bit of Appalachian Virginia, and Kentucky. And basically, I argue by comparing these regions, it reveals the ways in which emancipation's effect on border gender roles was muted by the region's hybrid culture and antebellum experience. So, I'm sorry, I wish this was bigger so you could see these maps better. But I look at 6 sample counties within these 3 states. I look at Franklin County and Warren County in Kentucky. And then in West Virginia, I look at Ohio County. Then in Virginia, I have Tazewell County, Fauquier County, and Amelia County. So looking at comparing these 6 counties, I have kind of a few central conclusions. Basically, by looking at, so in order to get at their attitudes toward gender roles, I like to look at divorce and these divorce records. And what I find is that in postbellum Kentucky, the rhetoric and language that is used in divorce records and the demands or causes that they're using to file for divorce are consistent with the antebellum era. They don't show a lot of disruption in this period. There's a lot of continuity there. In postbellum West Virginia, there is this sharp increase in the number of divorces, and the types of divorces themselves are different, which I argue is not necessarily as much a result of emancipation and the end of the Civil War as it is of the fact that West Virginia has become a new state during the Civil War, which means it has new laws, and that changes what divorce looks like. In postbellum Appalachian Virginia, you see an increase in divorce cases, but they are not using as wide a range of causes for those divorces as you're going to see in what I would call the kind of proper border South, Kentucky and West Virginia. And I think that has to do with the ways in which they're still restricted by Virginia law. but they share a lot socially with these other border regions, but they have to follow the kind of state statutes of Virginia. Meanwhile, in postbellum Virginia, there is this backlash against divorce, and they actually talk about it, the way in which they speak about it, they kind of talk about how they need to maintain marriage and hierarchy because they are seeing it slip away with the loss of slavery in these households. So emancipation and Reconstruction look different in the border South than they do in other parts of the South. Kentucky and West Virginia were never formally Confederate states. I mean, I suppose you can argue with some people in Kentucky and West Virginia about that, but I would say they were never formally Confederate states. And so as a result, they are treated slightly differently after the end of the war. The types of people who are in power in those places are going to be different. They're not stripped of power in the same way because they're not the same kind of Confederate control. They have a different experience of warfare than places like Virginia, not the same wide-scale experience of war. But that being said, I don't want in any way to say that there wasn't tremendous racial animosity in these places. Scholars like Aaron Astor and Ann Marshall have shown the ways in which in Kentucky, for instance, there was a lot of racial backlash after the war, and Ann Marshall, for one, talks about the ways in which Kentucky becomes in some ways more Confederate in its identity after the Civil War. What I find that's unusual is that at the same time as they are kind of trying to recreate the same racial system that they saw under slavery, they're not necessarily trying to reimpose the same level of gender hierarchy that you see happening in Virginia. So this is a chart that shows the number of divorces before and after the war, and shows the ways in which it increases. You see it is increasing in all of these places, but it's increasing most sharply, especially Ohio County in West Virginia. It actually goes up 300% in the post-war period. But I also think it's important to not just look at the flat numbers. Of course I don't. I'm not a quantitative historian. I want to look at what they're actually saying in these cases too, which is what I'm going to spend the rest of my time on. There's also some interesting statewide differences. Kentucky and Virginia have the same relative population during this period, but in the 10 years after the Civil War, Kentuckians file for 5 times as many divorces as Virginians do. Okay, so hang on, let me find my little section. So I'm gonna give you some examples from some of these court cases, because I like to tell the stories of the court cases the best. One of the ways in which we can see this kind of backlash to divorce in Virginia divorce cases is in the case of Georgiana Bailey. Georgiana Bailey sued her husband James for divorce in 1867. Her case was originally filed in the Wythe County Circuit Court. She has cited abandonment, adultery, and cruelty as the reasons she wanted a divorce. Her husband had been a widower at the time they married and a father of 9, and a professional gambler who traveled for his work. At one point, he left her, but this time seemingly without intending to return. And so she writes to him, and he writes back and says, like, I'll support you, but, quote, as for ever living together as husband and wife, that is played out. I have no love for you, nor ever will again, for the simple reason that you are not what I believed you to be. So she files for divorce, and the Wythe County Circuit Court agrees, and they divorce her. James appeals that ruling, and it gets taken up to the Supreme Court of Virginia, and they do uphold it. So they basically say, we're sympathetic to her, we feel like he's taken advantage of her, but they kind of note that they hope that this case is really an exception and not the rule. They write, happily for the interests of society and the sanctity of marital rights and relations, suits of this character are not of frequent occurrence in the state. And then they have this massive quote. I'll read it to you. Amid the whelming tide of social and political revolutions which threaten to sweep away all the forms of our cherished Southern civilization, one pillar at least of the social fabric may still stand firm, and that the time may never come when the sacred bond of matrimony can be lightly broken, or the holy duties and high obligations it imposes can be disregarded with impunity. but that marriage may be in the future, as it has been in the past, ever recognized in Virginia as an institution to be cherished by law and sanctified by religion, as one upon which alone the happiness and purity of social and domestic life must ever depend. So this is kind of my argument, and they're stating it baldly here. They're showing the ways in which they're saying, you know, at this moment where so much in Southern society is changing, and namely we see the end of slavery and the Southern way of life, we hope that we don't see a shift when it comes to marriage and the household. You can see as well the ways in which this happens in individual cases, so ordinary Virginians making mention of these things. John Craig, a Fauquier County resident, also made these comments. His wife filed for divorce in 1870 against him, and when he responded to her divorce bill, he said, quote, "He was advised that the marriage tie is one of love, obligation, and not dissolvable at the whim of parties. And that although rapidly advancing in radicalism, the state of Virginia is not yet up to Indiana in the cause of free love and general licentiousness." Yes, Indiana, just wild there. I can say that because I was born in Indiana. Indiana at this point was actually known as a divorce haven. It's quite a thing to think about now, but it was a place where if you wanted to get a divorce and you couldn't in your state, you would go there. So he's basically saying, like, again, I know things are changing, but hopefully they're not changing that rapidly. Meanwhile, though, in West Virginia, they are changing their laws. So West Virginia becomes a state in 1863. They hold a constitutional convention, and they specifically look at changing laws that relate to the household. Married women's property laws, divorce laws. And when they're talking about this, they actually talk about, we are doing this because it hasn't been done in Virginia. We want to be different from Virginia. And so some of the ways that they change Virginia law. So in Virginia, in the antebellum period, if you wanted to get an absolute divorce, you could only file for adultery, impotency, and imprisonment. So in the 19th century, there are two types of divorces you could get. You can get an absolute divorce, or you can get a divorce from bed and board. And a divorce from bed and board is more like a legal separation. Your finances are kind of disentangled, but you can't remarry. So if you want to be able to, like, move on from your life after your divorce, you're going to want an absolute divorce. But states usually make it harder to get an absolute divorce, and they have fewer causes for which you can get an absolute divorce. So Virginia only allows those three. West Virginia allows you to file if your partner has been, quote, notoriously licentious. So they add that in there. They also changed the number of years for which your spouse has to have abandoned you for you to file. In Virginia, it was 5 years that they had to have been gone. In West Virginia, it's 3, and you can use that to get an absolute divorce. Whereas in Virginia, that'll only get you a bed and board. And they also strike out the part of Virginia law that says if you committed adultery, you can't remarry. They get rid of that. So congratulations, adulterers can remarry. So what I noticed in my research on antebellum Western Virginia, and specifically on Ohio County, is that when I compared these 6 counties, I noticed what jumped out at me was the kind of shocking rate of adultery charges in Ohio County in the antebellum era. Over 90% of the divorces are filed charging the partner with adultery. And so I sat there and I was like, what is happening here? Either something's really in the water in the Ohio River, or they're making a specific choice to use the charge of adultery. Divorce court records are kind of an interesting thing to study. I think we all know the ways in which primary documents are biased and constructed, but divorce records are really biased and constructed. Obviously, no one necessarily wants to air everything to the court, but they also know they have to craft a certain narrative, especially in this era, if they're going to get a divorce at all. They have to convince a judge to give them that divorce. So West Virginians, before the Civil War, they're using Virginia law, and they know the only way they can get an absolute divorce is through adultery, impotency, and imprisonment. Impotency and imprisonment, that requires government or medical records to prove, whereas adultery, you don't have to have all that. So it becomes the easiest charge to use if you just want to get a divorce. And what is especially notable about that is in the post-war period, even though the number of divorces skyrockets, the percentage of those that use adultery as the basis of the case drops dramatically, which is really unusual to see after a war. I'm just going to say it. Usually after a war, the number of adultery charges in a society goes up for reasons I'm not going to get into now. But it does not in Ohio County, and I think that has to do with the fact that the law has changed, not behavior, so that this was something they wanted more access to divorce before the Civil War, and now they've gained it in the post-war period. Meanwhile, in Kentucky, you see much more consistency, like I said. Antebellum Kentucky was one of only 3 states in the United States that allowed you to separate for something that was called mutual separation. And mutual separation means that you're married and you don't want to be married anymore, and you say to the court, we don't want to be married anymore. And they're like, okay, you don't have to be married anymore. It's a shocking idea, I know. It's called a no-fault divorce. It doesn't happen in the 19th century. Usually in the 19th century, you have to have this narrative where one person has committed all these sins and the other person is blameless. Kentucky says if you separate and then you're apart for 5 years, we'll allow you to get divorced. So we can see this in the records of Kentuckians. For example, E. Hensley, a middle-aged man from Franklin County, Kentucky, cited irreconcilable differences when his wife filed for divorce in September 1867. The court upheld his charges. Similarly, A.P. Carr, a woman in Franklin County, in 1869, she filed for divorce, calling her marriage an unfortunate one, and said the couple's, quote, dispositions, education, and temperaments were so different, they did not and could not agree. Her husband, W.H. Carr, responded, uniting in her prayer that they both be divorced. This is unusual in the 19th century. Most courts don't want to see any instances of what is called collusion. Basically, collusion would be the idea that you agreed to a divorce. Courts don't like that. The same judge who had made that huge quote about the tide turning, he wrote in this era that the courts were basically responsible for preventing collusion amongst couples. And what we don't want to see couples who are unhappy agreeing to get divorces and then the courts allowing them to do so. We also see this with John Crittenden. One of the few Black Kentuckians who I find in these records. He sues his wife Agnes Jane in 1866 for divorce, saying that they had separated by mutual consent. The only difference you see in his record here, he gets the same access to divorce. They do require more witnesses to show the legality of his marriage that they don't require for Hensley and Carr. Even in Kentucky cases where they're not using that mutual separation charge, you can see evidence of some agreement. So over half of the Kentuckians who responded to their partner's charges for divorce, wow, this brings back so many memories. It's been a beautiful day and all of a sudden it's just pouring. But over half of those who filed in response to their partner suing them for the divorce wrote back and said, yeah, I also agree, I would like a divorce. Some of them said, well, I want a divorce, but I don't agree that it was abandonment, I think it was this instead. But you still see that evidence that they're agreeing ultimately to this divorce in the first place. Overall, Kentuckians use less quote-unquote emotional language. That emotional language comes from David Silkenath's work on divorce in North Carolina. And it kind of describes, again, the ways in which most people who filed for divorce had to make these narratives of I was the perfect wife, I did everything I absolutely could have, I put up with this for years and years and years, but this person did all of these horrible things, otherwise I wouldn't have taken this step. And you can see this again in the Virginia cases. In specifically, I'm going to look at the Suddeths. So Susanna Suddeth married her husband William in 1841, but she only lived with him occasionally in the 25 years in which they were married before she filed for divorce in Fauquier County, Virginia. Their first separation came I've lost my pages. 1842. She fled to her husband's house after enduring basically months of drunken abuse from her husband. They lived apart until her husband returned after the Mexican War in 1849. She says, I believed that he had changed with the war, so I agreed to live with him again. They lived together for 3 more years, at which point she leaves him again due to his, quote, returning habits of drunkenness, maltreatment, and neglect. She basically says, like, I would have been fine with this. It's her court case, or her petition says she truly preferred, quote, long to suffer in silence and carry with her uncomplainingly through life the burden of her blasted hopes than to bring her grief upon the public gaze. Basically, she says, though, what happens is that after the Civil War, William brings another woman into his house, starts calling her his wife, and to the whole community and to other family members. She says, like, this is the thing that finally broke me, but I want you to know I put in 25 years. So that's that emotional language where she's really trying to craft this as not something that was taken lightly. And we can see that when we compare things like the length of marriage before divorce in these counties. Virginians who file for divorce tend to be married for at least 10, 15, 20 years, whereas, like, I have 2 cases in West Virginia where they were married for 1 day, and they were like, this isn't gonna work. And so that's like unheard of in Virginia. And there's also a longer time between the length of, between the crisis, so the point in which you say, like, I discovered they were committing adultery, or they abandoned me, and the filing. In Virginia, again, that can be decades, whereas in Kentucky and West Virginia, it tends to be exactly the same length of time that the law requires. 6 months, a year, 3 years. You also see a higher rate of that bed and board divorce. 40%, for instance, in Fauquier County, Virginia, 40% of the divorce cases are bed and board divorces, whereas none of them in Kentucky and only a couple in West Virginia will be bed and board. So you see differences in how they're using that. And then finally, the use of this kind of next friend. So in the 19th century, married women had very few rights after they got married. They lost their legal identity. And in a lot of places, courts would require that married women, children, and people who were mentally incapacitated had to sue with a next friend. It was basically the idea that they didn't have any legal standing in the court. They had to find someone who did have legal standing to sue with them. Every single woman who files it for divorce in Virginia in the post-war period sues with an ex-friend. Not a single woman in West Virginia or Kentucky do. And there's actually a Supreme Court case in which specifically the Kentucky judges talk about the fact that they think the next friend device is harmful to women, would not allow them the same access to divorce and legal rights. So we can see the ways in which they conceptualize these things differently. So the one thing I did want to talk about, though, that I found really interesting, and I didn't really uncover this until I moved from the kind of dissertation to book phase, but I was looking at Amelia County in Virginia. Amelia County is in the heart of kind of plantation Virginia. In the antebellum era, 70% of its population was enslaved. So this is a county with a huge legacy of slavery. In the antebellum era, it only had 2 divorces in the 10 years before the Civil War. I found Amelia County because I just started with the heaviest, like the counties that had the most, highest populations of enslaved people. And then I started looking for the divorce records. I will say I found 2 other ones before this that had none, but I was like, that doesn't work for me. So I went to Amelia County because it had all of 2. In the post-war period, they have 7. And so when I first saw that, that's not a huge number by any means, but it is 3 times as many. So I was like, what is happening here? This changes everything I thought. It shows, you know, this goes against what I thought I was going to find. But when I started to look into the cases themselves, what I found is that 5 out of the 7 cases were filed by Black Virginians. And so this kind of showed me something else that was happening here. Obviously, 70% of the county was enslaved before the war. Those enslaved people would not have had access to legal marriage, let alone legal divorce. So one thing that's happening is you see a group that did not have access to the courts before having access. The other thing that's going on is during the post-war period, Black Virginians, like Black Southerners at large, are legalizing and certifying these marriages that didn't have protections before. So you see this coming from within the Black community. You also see white Southerners talking about the ways in which they can kind of have Black Southerners get engaged with this very like paternalistic attitude toward Black relationships. So one of the things that happens in Virginia is you have the passage of the Cohabitation Act of 1866. That act legalized formerly enslaved people's marriages and gave their children legitimacy. It basically said that, quote, where colored persons before the passage of this act shall have undertaken and agreed to occupy the relation to each other of husband and wife, and shall be cohabiting together as such at the time of its passage, whether the rites of marriage shall have been celebrated between them or not, so like maybe they didn't even agree that they wanted to be married, they shall now be deemed husband and wife as if they had been duly married by law. So it's an interesting law because it basically creates all of a sudden a new group of married people. So I'm going to give you examples from 2 of these 5 divorces. Richard Craddock, his relationship with his wife Malvinia had been legalized under the 1866 Act, and he had lived with her from that point until 1870. At that point, Malvinia was brought before the Amelia County Court, charged with bigamy. And he, at that point, used that bigamy charge. She's convicted of bigamy, and then he uses that charge to get an adultery charge put against her, and then they file for divorce, and he is granted that charge. Samuel Minge, he files in 1870. He and his wife Laura had been living together as husband and wife since before the war. His divorce petition says, quote, as was the custom among slaves prior to their emancipation. And then their marriage also was legalized under this 1866 Act. 2 years later, however, he starts to worry that she is becoming distant. Within a few months, he learns the reason, which is that she is taken up with another man and she's pregnant with his child. He files for divorce based on adultery, and he also gets it. Both of those are also unusual in Virginia during this period. We see out of those 5 cases that are filed, all of them are successful, which is not always the case in these Virginia courtrooms. So basically, what I argue is that whereas white divorces could imperil white male power in the post-emancipation household, we saw that fear in that state Supreme Court, Black divorces seem to prove no such threat to the white powers that be. Black women had never been granted the benefits of femininity, or Black men the rights of masculine power in the American South, and they struggled to claim them in the postbellum world. To see Black divorce as threatening, white Virginians would have had to implicitly recognize Black men as dominant and their dominance as worthy of being protected. They would have also had to recognize Black relationships as equally worthy of moral protection with white relationships, another thing that most white Virginians proved unwilling to do. So in Amelia County, after the Civil War, Black emancipation gave more people access to the legal system. But although they found success in the courts, that success did not necessarily reflect racial progress, and in fact suggests that white Virginians sought to place Black marriages on a lower plane than their own. And David Silkenat has also argued some of this and found the ways in which white Southerners will actually use Black divorces as a kind of tool against the Black community in this Reconstruction era. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip my own conclusion, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Bell's scholarship. So if there's anything we all know, it's that, and we've seen over the last day, that Bell Link's scholarship has been both voluminous and varied. He's studied everything from the secession crisis in Virginia to the ideology of Southern progressives to the right-wing ideology of Jesse Helms in the late 20th century. While this is one of the things that obviously, as we've talked about, makes him such an amazing scholar, it's also incredibly rare and valuable resource for an advisor. Whatever your topic, Bell knows the literature, like whatever it is. And he probably knows everyone who studies it, which is amazing. It's clear that he has studied broadly because he has a deep well of curiosity about Southern history, and he imparts that to his students. When I started at UF, I already knew that my dissertation would look at gender roles in the border South. I was so thrilled to find an advisor who seemed genuinely excited to learn along with me and be on this journey with me. As an advisor, Bill was constantly encouraging and reassuring while also challenging me to improve my ideas and my writing. I can't even tell you how many times I quote him to my students now. It's like my advisor told me all the time. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my ideas with him and for all the feedback, for the Milbauer Research Seminar that let me refine my work and share it with scholars like Michelle, and for the opportunities to travel and present around the world. I've only been overseas 3 times in my life, and twice were with Bill. So, that was just an invaluable thing for me as a student and as a person. Reviewing Bill's work and thinking about his legacy, as well as how he influenced my own work, it's clear that he thinks deeply about the shaping and creation of Southern identity. In his book, Southern Crucible, he writes, quote, "For most of my career, I have been intrigued with the possibility of writing an integrated history that engages the ways the American South persists so powerfully in culture and self-identity, and why the survival of a regional consciousness continues to attract Keene students in the 21st century." So first of all, I only hope that I'm one of those Keene students, maybe, just maybe. But at the very least, I share his fascination with the longevity and elasticity of a Southern consciousness. In my work on the border South, I try to understand how or if those living on the edges of the regions conceptualize themselves as Southerners, and how that changes our understanding of the South itself during the Civil War. In my new work, I hope to address the development of another regional identity buried within the larger Southern identity, namely Appalachian identity, through the study of Tom Dooley, The Ballad of Tom Dooley, and Laura Foster. Bill has called the American South, quote, "the most distinctive region in the United States." And no matter the time or place, his books all explore what makes this region so unique. Ultimately, over his books, he argues that the South's sense of identity came together through the, quote, "shared experiences of slavery, geography, and ethnicity." That being said, he's also constantly aware that although a common thread ties the region together, there's tremendous variation within this place. Ultimately, he argues that it may be, quote, "more useful to regard the South as a highly diverse region, often at odds with itself, which shared a regional identity based on unique historical forces." As someone who wanted to study the formation of a regional identity, but also found myself gravitating toward the borders of that region, I found his work and his guidance extremely helpful. For me, the work that remains the most influential is Roots of Secession. In it, Bill explores the political forces leading to secession in Virginia. First, as a West Virginian and a person who studies the state, I was thrilled to see some actual attention to West Virginia. His coverage of the western part of the state also fits with his argument about Virginia's identity as a border southern state. Like his view of the South as a whole, he sees Virginia as incredibly diverse, with major geographical, economic, and social differences that influence secession. According to Bill, Western Virginians and their, quote, "strong and separate political consciousness contributed greatly to this border state identity," seen still in my determination to call Virginia Eastern Virginia. Acknowledging the diversity within the state allows Bill to explore the ways Virginia's secession story differs from those in other parts of the South, and also how these differing views of secession reflected Southerners' beliefs in other parts of the South, too. And yet his work in Roots of Secession also reminded me not to forget the thread that continued to connect these, quote, "many Souths," slavery. The peculiar institution and attitudes towards those enslaved within it drove so many of the political and social choices of Virginians. Roots of Secession reminds us to center not only the discussions of slavery, but the voices and actions of enslaved and free Black people in the story of secession, and ultimately in the story of the South itself. I want to thank Bill for inviting me here today, and even more so, I want to thank him for his advice, his guidance, and his friendship. Thank you.
that was excellent, and I'm going to try to stand up. There is time for questions. I'm thinking the best answer is to give you guys microphones.
A question for you two. One, I was wondering if the young slave women and their parents ever sought to conceal the fact that they had, come to their nature, where we should put that, in order to delay the burdens and vulnerabilities that would come women that you described. And in your case, Allison, I was wondering if you was always trying to figure out what's the reason that one area is more conservative than the other in terms of gender, and would still more casualty rates make any difference in those regardless of where it's not.
So that's an excellent question. Can you all hear me? No? Okay.
It doesn't actually make your voice louder, it records.
My bad. So I haven't encountered anything specifically in terms of WPA interviews, but I would imagine just based on how protective parents were, that certainly would not have been something that they would use in their arsenal to prevent their children from being exposed to the harsh realities. Even though slave masters and mistresses sought to display enslaved people as not having emotion and not being individuals who were the best at parenting and things of that nature, that certainly was not the case. That we see in how they would shield their children from work responsibilities, and even in some cases in describing them to enslaved overseers, they would oftentimes attempt to minimize the level of work that they were capable of doing, because in reality, they don't want their children out there exposed to that. And so while the documents in and of itself aren't that explicit, I would make an informed, educated guess to say that that would be the case. And that's certainly something that I would consider as I'm continuing to get into reviewing those source materials and seeking new ones.
So I would say that I think that certainly Civil War casualties play a part. I haven't seen it directly as much, but I think that the loss of so many Southern men, especially Southern men of like quote unquote marriageable age at this point, inevitably has an impact. I also think there's some area in which the loss of the Confederacy, right? And other scholars have talked about this. It's so hard to pin down, but just the idea of like this group of people, white Confederates that went in and assumed they would easily win, and then they lost, that kind of blow of that psychological blow that they sustain, which isn't necessarily the same for Kentuckians and West Virginians who don't have that same experience. I think that inevitably leads to this kind of clinging to these hierarchies in ways that are hard to pin down, but I think that certainly plays a role too.
And if there's a much larger rate of casualties, say in Virginia than West Virginia, part of that would redound to just a lack of people who needed a divorce.
That's true. That's true. It's hard to pin down the casualty rates in Kentucky and West Virginia because of, they're not tracking it in the same way in terms of guerrilla warfare, and Kentuckians and West Virginians serve sometimes outside the state too, and so it's a little bit harder to pin down in those places, but I think it would certainly play a role. Thank you.
Well, yeah.
I wanted to ask specifically, if somebody had a vetted board of divorce and that wasn't an absolute divorce, so they couldn't necessarily go to other people and have relationships with them, but say if somebody did have relationships with the other person, so the other person filed suit again, and then this is adultery and absolute divorce.
Yes, they can, and I've seen that happen. I haven't seen a lot of it, but yes, that could be used as a charge. So yeah, that's a good point.
My question is about, to you, Dr. Moore, a question about kind of, you talk about black girlhood and clothing, but did you find anything about hair specifically and how, like,
Could you repeat the last portion of what you
about
said?
hair specifically, and how hair, like, what role hair played in, like, black girlhood?
So I addressed that in looking at headdress. And so in looking at headdress for enslaved individuals, it was a sign of status for them to wear a headdress. They're not necessarily speaking a great deal about hair within WPA narratives. However, in white journals, they speak to issues of hair in a coded manner in terms of making it a distinction as it relates to gender. So they would oftentimes reference enslaved children as its, and then sometimes the its would be considered boys. And so one case in particular is William Russell's diary, and he's talking about the little child who's assisting him that day, and he says, well, I thought it was a boy until it told me differently. And so that definitely makes projections onto hair, because the texture of African American hair is such that, as we know today with natural styles, a small afro could be easily worn by both sexes, and yet it was a complete disregard for understanding that potential component. But interestingly enough, I'm making a connection between hair and headdress with modern youth today, and how with dress codes, they cannot, like young teenage girls are unable to wear the beautiful head wraps and those things that reflect their sense of culture, because dress codes ban those things. And so it's interesting that there were certain spaces in antebellum society where headdresses were a part of defining your space, and today how those same ideas prevent you from being in certain spaces if you violate those rules that have been set by mainstream America.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for Allison. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the patterns you found fit in nationally with patterns elsewhere? I know you started by that question early on writing your dissertation.
In terms of how the divorce rate is kind of moving at a national level, you mean?
Yeah, how it compares. Is it an example of Southern distinctiveness, you think, or?
I think what I've generally found is that Kentucky and West Virginia, in the types of divorces that they are filing and in the number of divorces they are filing for, I think they follow national patterns. And I think you see Virginia following like a more stereotypically Southern pattern in terms of this kind of reticence against divorce. Reconstruction is a little bit of a blip in some places in the South, because some Southern states actually liberalized their divorce laws during Reconstruction because of these kind of Reconstruction governments that are kind of imposed on them. But then immediately after Reconstruction, you see them kind of repealing those laws. South Carolina is the best example of that. And so I still think that kind of 40-year period after the Civil War in most of these southern states, you see this reluctance to allow easy access to divorce, and you don't see that outside of the South, and you don't see that as much in the border South. The one thing I will say that throws me off is New York is the one exception to that. New York is like the thing that prevents me from making too much of a Southern exceptionalism argument. New York is really, it's not a good place to get divorced in the 19th century. And honestly, New York only allowed no-fault divorce within the last 10 years. Like, yeah. And so they have their own kind of thing going on. I don't think they're doing it for the same reasons the South is. That's what I would say is different. But there are ways in which you can see slight variations that make me hesitate to make too much of a regional statement, I would say.
And how much variety within the South was there?
So the variety, it tends to, I would say, have a little bit of, so there's more variety the farther west in the south you get and the farther north. So it's the borders, both the border I look at and I guess maybe more the border that Angela's border, more toward the western border. Yeah, there are more borders. The South has lots of borders. But yeah, I would say the edges of the South tend to be the places where you're going to see more deviation.
Was South Carolina the only one that,
South Carolina's the only one that's like not at all.
the 1950s?
Well, they have like during Reconstruction, there's a little blip where they allow it, but then they take it away really most of the time. Not at all.
Pitchfork's been telling those about South Carolina was the state that should show the rest of the nation how to treat women, because we don't allow divorce where we allow where a man is able to ditch his wife when she becomes shriveled and scrawny, to take up with the bucks. This was on the Senate record. And also we have the unwritten law, which is the best way of taking care of men's womankind. This was all of his anti-veto before of the Senate, by the way. Just, I digress.
Before we break for lunch, I just want to say good luck to Bill Lincoln, his next chapter. Because there is another chapter, I'm sure. And beautifully done.
Yeah, well done.
Maybe tomorrow. Our mommy did it. Now it's
I'm so pleased you. I thought that the dissertation you defended could be published the next day. I mean,